Okay, so for this next video lecture, so we will be discussing about the common methods in selecting the sample. Okay, so the auditor should select items for the sample with the expectation that all sampling units in the population will have the chance of selection. So here, the auditor may use the following sample selection methods. Okay, so we have the random sampling, systematic, stratified, haphazard, and block sampling. So we will discuss each of them as we go along. For the first method, random sampling. So here, this is also known as probability sampling. So this involves selecting items from the population so that each item has an equal or a known chance of being selected, meaning every item has the chance to be selected. Okay, so the auditor will use some tools to determine objectively, okay, what items to be included. But in this case, all of the items will have the chance to be selected. So random selection, this will require the use of random number tables, or this can also be done through the use of random number generators in a computer. So the random number table, this is composed of the list of randomly selected number which may be used by the auditor. Okay, so this is a list of the number that represents the item in the population. For example, in the asset account, so we have for number 1, that's cash, number 2, accounts receivable, and so on. So random number generators, on the other hand, these are computer programs that generate random numbers for the auditor. Okay, so the random number table, later on, the items that will be selected will be subjected to a procedure. Okay, so here the auditor should make sure that the sample being selected is representative of the population so that audit risk and sampling risk will be minimized or reduced. So in random sampling, so these are the steps that the auditor should usually follow. First, he will relate identifying numbers, or he can also use the letters to sampling units in the population. This is what I have mentioned earlier. For example, number 1 is cash, number 2 receivable for the asset accounts. Okay. Next, the auditor will derive a random sample from the population with the aid of a random number table or random number generator. Meaning this is how the auditor will determine what number or what letter to be included in his sample. Okay, so the auditor will not be the one to select. It's the random table or generators. Okay, that is the one who will select what item or what number or what letter to be included in the sample. Next, okay, so those are the steps, okay, for the random sampling. Okay, so this will identify what items to be included later on. So under the sampling unit, this sampling unit, may be in physical terms. For example, check number, invoice number, page number, and warehouse row. So this is the sampling unit where the population or the sample can be taken from the population of the class of transactions or account balance. So random sampling may be restricted or unrestricted. For unrestricted, or this is also known as simple random sampling with replacement, meaning there is a fixed number of items to be selected. Okay, so each item is selected, or each time, an item is selected, any item on the frame can be selected into the sample once again. For example, there are 5 items, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the population. Okay, based on the random table and random number generator, the auditor will include item number 3. Okay, in this case, although item number 3 is already selected, it can still be reselected again. Okay, so that is with replacement. So this means that the sample item can be selected into the sample for multiple times. Okay. So conversely, in a restricted simple random sampling without replacement, so this is the opposite of the first one. So a fixed number of items are selected, and when an item is selected into the sample, it can only be selected once. It cannot be selected for the next random number selection. Okay, for example, in our example earlier, if item number 3 is already selected, so it will be eliminated, okay, for the next selection. So only items not selected earlier can be part of the sample again to be selected. So this is one of the most common method actually of random sampling. Okay, of course, when using unrestricted, this will be time consuming because you will include the same item again. That's why random sampling with restriction are most commonly used. So for the same sample, random sampling without replacement will always be statistically more efficient than with replacement. Okay, so that is the first method, okay, that the auditor can use. The second one is systematic sampling. Okay, systematic sampling, or this is what we call interval sampling. So this is consists of sequencing all items of the population. So sampling units are put in a numerical order. And then, the auditor will divide the population into intervals of equal size based on the number of sampling units that must be chosen for the sample. Okay, so meaning from the population, for example, we have 10. Okay, and then the auditor will divide this into intervals to get the required number of sampling units, okay, to be chosen as part of the evaluation. So he will choose the sampling unit for each of the derived intervals. Okay, so the selection interval can be determined by dividing the population. In research, or in sampling, I mean, this capital letter N represents the population, and the smaller one is the sample. Okay, please take note of that. Okay. For instance, okay, this is an example. If the population is composed of 1,000 items or units, and the desired sample size, or the sample size that the auditor will evaluate, is only 100 units, so the auditor will select a random starting point between 1 and the sampling interval of 10. Okay, in this case, the auditor divided 1,000 by 100 units. Okay, so he will select starting point between 1 and sampling interval of 10. Okay, so that's how systematic sampling is. Okay, so for example, this is 10. Okay, every interval of 10. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, okay, until 100. Okay, the sample will, or the selection will repeat, okay, from the beginning and will end once the number of sample size is reached, which is 100 units. So meaning every 10, that is our sample. Okay. Then he will randomly choose the first sampling unit from the first interval. So this is the example. After including the random start, for example 5. Okay, so he can use a random start as well. Okay, so for example, he started from 5 as part of the sample. So the auditor then will select every 10. So meaning 15, 25, 35, and so on. Okay, that's how sampling or systematic sampling is done. Okay, so this approach usually results in a true random sample. Okay, so however, bias may result if a pattern in the population exists that coincides with the selection interval, but most of the time, this is normally not happening. Okay, for instance, if every 10 sampling unit or multiples of 10 happens to be departmental manager, then based on the random start, the sample derived may yield either all departments or none. Okay, but this is the auditor will have to do something about it to make sure that this sample will represent the population. Okay. Another is, nonetheless, the possibility of introducing a bias into the sample as a result of pattern can be minimized. So this is what we are talking about. How to do that? The auditor will have multiple starting points in the selection process, or by using an interval that does not coincide with such pattern. So when there is no numerical sequence to a population, so here the auditor will find it easier to use systematic sampling rather than random sampling. Okay, so if document records or transactions are unnumbered, okay, there is no need to number them physically using systematic sampling. Okay, so he will just gather from the documents, okay, based on their order. Okay, so if random number table selection was involved, the drawback would be to require numbering, where in this systematic sampling, what order they may be in the file, that will be the sequence or order that the auditor will follow. So when systematic sampling, or with systematic sampling, the auditor uses sampling interval only as a basis for selecting the documents to be examined. So systematic sampling, so this normally applies to both statistical and non-statistical sampling. Okay, so the next method is stratified sampling. Okay, what do we mean by stratified sampling? So stratification simply involves dividing the population into subpopulations or strata, each of which is a group, okay, which sample units that have similar characteristics, often, for example, monetary value. Okay, for example, this is for a population of the asset group, and then the asset group will be subdivided further into current and non-current. Current items will be subdivided further into their amounts. For example, above 1 million, below 1 million, and so on. So that's how to stratify. Okay, so stratification of accounting population is usually based on the record book value amounts. Okay, of the line items where the population is divided into different strata according to their book values. And a sample will be selected independently from each strata. So there will be a sample taken from current and non-current, above 1 million and below 1 million. There will be a sample that will be taken from each strata. So stratified sampling will enable the auditor to direct efforts on the items which contain general potential misstatement. For example, he will audit those which have large value items to detect material errors or fraud. So stratified sampling is also used when a population has a high vulnerability. That is, certain types of population are distinct from the other parts. Okay. For instance, some accounts in the population are in terms of millions, while others only in thousand. Okay, so that's what we have taken as an example earlier. So stratified sampling may be used for both also statistical and non-statistical sampling approaches. Okay, the next method is haphazard select or sampling. So under this method, it involves selecting items from the population without following a structured technique. So simply stated, in this case, the auditor will just select sample items without regard to their size, shape, location, or other physical feature. So how do we do this? So in using haphazard sampling, the auditor should avoid any conscious bias, however, in selection, okay, of the population. For example, he will select only unusual or physical small items, or he will omit the first or last items in the population. Okay, so that should not be done. Okay. Next is due care must also be exercised in selecting the representative samples under this method, because again, there is no scientific approach that is being followed. Haphazard selection, however, is not appropriate, especially when using statistical sampling, because in this case, there is a scientific method that should be followed. Okay, because in this case, under the statistical sampling, it does not allow the auditor to measure the probability of selecting a given combination of the sampling units. Okay, and the last type is block sampling. So block or cluster sampling, so this involves selecting items from the population in a contiguous groups or blocks or groups. So a block sample is obtained by selecting several items in the sequence. Okay, so how to do this? Once the first item in the block is selected, the remainder of the block is chosen automatically. So it's like regrouping also the transactions or the amounts, just like your stratified sampling. For instance, the sample may consist of all vouchers processed during 2 weeks period, or all vouchers processed on a specific days. So meaning you regroup the transactions. Okay, so block samples could theoretically be representative samples but are rarely used because they are inefficient. Okay, so most likely this is under the judgmental sampling. So the time and expense to select sufficient blocks to so that the samples could be considered representative of the population is absurd. Okay, and this type of sampling is considered to be the least desirable because the auditor, like haphazard sampling, is also inappropriate for statistical sampling. Okay, so those are the different common methods in selecting samples.